To give you more examples of how functions work and how they can be used, I've written a bunch of code here that says a bunch of things about each robot that's in my list. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all this code, I'm going to move it into a function, and then we're going to see how it actually cleans up the code. And in the end, we're going to take a look at how we can do this even more effectively to tell us important information about each robot. So let's start with this right here. We want to print the robot's name. Now, I already showed you in the previous video how we can write a function to do this. But let's do a quick review. See if you can predict what I'm doing as I put together this function. So let's take a look at what I've done. So I've created a function called message_robot_name. It takes as a parameter a robot, and it returns a string. So this means this is going to give or return a string that looks like this. So I'm saying this robot is named, and I'm giving it this robot, whatever the current robot is, just insert the name of the robot into the string this way. And inside my code, I'm creating a message, and I'm setting it equal to message_robot_name for the current robot in my list. And then I'm printing out name message. So if I run this, we can see that we have printed out 15 robot messages. So we can see all of these in the list. Great, so we know that's working. Let's go to our next statement. So this is a switch case statement. It inputs a robot.robot type, and based on the robot type, it prints out a message that corresponds to how the robot moves. Let's move this into a function that will take in a robot and return a string that describes how the robot moves. So let's take a look. I'm creating a message describing how the robot moves. So message robot moves by. It takes in a robot and it returns a string. For the rest of this, I have pretty much the same structure, but I had to change this code right here, which used to say robot, to this robot, because that's the name here. One thing that I could do instead of that is I could leave this as robot and leave all the rest of these as robot, but that's a lot of work. So I'm not going to do that. Whatever the parameter name is here is what the rest of the code inside the function will use to refer to that particular robot. The other thing I had to do is change all the print statements to return statements. So I'm returning a string based on what the robot uses to get around. I'm going to use a similar structure to create a message that describes how the robot moves. Now, print the name message, and it will print the movement message. And the code works the same as it did before. It still is printing out the value for each individual one. It just so happens that I'm letting my function do the work to actually create the message that it then uses. Let's write one more function that compares the battery voltage. Let's do one more where I want to print out a statement that compares the current robot's battery voltage to the battery voltage of the Robinator 5000, which is this first robot. So you can see that I've done something a little bit different with this one. I've left the input of this to just be robot. That makes it so that I can just paste my code from the original code just right into this, because this is just referring to robot.battery voltage. The other thing that I had to change, as with the others, is instead of printing the statement, I am returning the statement, because this function returns a string. So now I've simplified this further, and I'm again just creating a compare message and I'm printing it out. Again, my code prints out information about the comparison between the current robot and the Robinator 5000. So you can see that we're getting same battery voltage, greater, or same throughout. So that's working as we expect. Okay, this last one I'm going to do a little bit differently because all of these functions have taken in a robot and returned a string. But you can see at this point I'm trying to print out a statement that says whether the robot has a lot of motors or not. This time, what I'm going to do is I want to make a function that just tells me, does the current robot have a lot of motors or not? And based on that, I'm going to print a different statement. So let's make our function first. Okay, let's take a look at what I've done. So I've created a function that, just like all the others, takes in a robot. But this time, my function is returning a bool. I want to just return either a true or a false. And so I have this statement, return true if the robot.motor number is greater than 6, or false otherwise. And I'm going to actually get rid of this. And so I'm going to get rid of this print statement so that this function just answers the question, does the robot have lots of motors? And you can see down here, I'm using this function inside my if-then statement. So if this is equal to true, print out, robot has a lot of motors. Otherwise, do this. And so this structure is a little bit different than what I did with the others. If we run the code, we again get a set of statements for whether a robot, each individual robot in our list has a lot of motors or not. One other thing that some of you have discovered is that we don't actually even need to have that double equals true, because if we're just taking the output of a Boolean statement into an if-else statement, this statement right here, does robot have lots of motors, is either going to be true or false. So we can directly use the output of this function to decide what to do. I'm going to refine this even more by creating a variable that stores. I'm going to make a different function that returns a string, just like all the others, so that we can have a string that shows whether the robot has a lot of motors or not. Okay, so you can see I've created this new function that, again, slightly different than the other one, returns a string. And sometimes it makes sense to just write a function that does one thing, and there's no reason to delete your code when you have functions that each have some good functionality. So does robot have lots of motors? This one returns a bool. Message for lots of motors, this one returns a string. And so we have a use for each one. And now when we run this, we are printing out a message for every single robot in our list. And so you can see Robo B does not have a lot of motors. I'm going to switch this to single. So Robo B has a lower battery voltage than Robinator 5000. So this is actually doing all of these things for all of the motors in our list. Okay. Now, I have one last idea, and that is to make a function that basically generates a message that is the combination of all of these messages together. Okay, so what I've done here is I've created a single function that generates a robot message for a given robot. If I were to run this, nothing actually happens because I don't call this function. So let's call this function on the Robinator 5000. Again, that's test data. That's the first element of the test data list. So if we look at this, we can see that we see all 4 of our messages here in a row. Now I've used a /n, which allows me to make a new line in my print statement so that we can actually see everything together, which was an issue. We couldn't always see everything when our messages got too long. So having that /n in there makes it so that you can see all of the statements in one place. Now this one function is really powerful because I'm using all 4 of my other functions together. And so with this one call to my function of generate robot message, I'm actually doing a lot of stuff for each of my robots. If I wanted to, I could now restore my for loop and generate a robot message for each of my robots. Let's do that. And so you can see I've taken all of that code that I used to have and reduced it to this. That's a lot of simplification. And so this is the power that functions can have to really make our code much easier to understand and easier to read. It also means that you can separate the responsibilities of everything you want to do with your code into separate functions and really make it so that your code sticks together as a series of specific steps rather than a whole bunch of lines of code that it's easy to get confused by. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.